And we also know how our beloved Prophet, peace be upon him, received the words with great difficulty. He himself would describe that it was the most painful of experiences when he received revelation, and at times he felt that his life would be taken through the experience. And yet it was this message that he longed for when he went back to society, when he went back to the humanity around him. He recognized the unbearable social injustices that were prevalent, and his inability to do anything about it forced him to seclude himself and contemplate and reflect and think about creation and try and connect with something more powerful out there that would somehow make sense of all of this. And we know also that this was just the beginning of his trials and tribulations, how he would be mocked and ridiculed by people that were close to him, his friends, his family, how he would be bribed or attempted to be bribed and tested with material gains or power, and how he would lose loved ones through starvation, through torture. How at Taif he runs away, escaping youth that are throwing stones and belittling him and laughing at him for what he has brought to the people, as though it has so little relevance. And how the angel comes to him and says, "Shall we crush these people between these two mountains?" And he replies, "No. No, perhaps from their children there may be believers." And we know from history, indeed, from their children do come believers. I have already mentioned how the Qur'an was not revealed as one book, but in stages over a period of 23 years, which would take into account the changing social circumstances, the historical and cultural context, according to the needs and the requirements of society at that time. For this reason, in order to fully understand what was meant by a certain verse, one must be familiar with the circumstances surrounding its revelation, as some passages were revealed in response to specific events or problems that were faced within the community at that time. And yet the overarching principle of the Qur'an are eternal, from this ever-revealing book of wisdom that is relevant for all societies at all times. Every generation that reads it should find information that is relevant and important and inspires them to feel that this is the miracle of God. And God tells us, and we have sent down to you step by step this book to make all matters clear, and as guidance and grace and good tidings unto all who have submitted themselves to God. God commands justice, the doing of good, and giving to one's relatives, and he forbids all that is shameful and that runs counter to reason, in addition to aggression. He exhorts you so that you may bear this in mind. Surah 16, verses 89 to 90. But if we really want to make the Qur'an relevant to our lives, if we really want to keep this message alive, as it indeed, I believe, was meant to be, we need to take into account some underlying principles that enable this to be possible. I want to give you 3 examples of this. The first is, if we actually go back to looking at the science of the Qur'an. Now there's countless examples in the Qur'an, as you'll all know, which look at sort of scientific facts, from astronomy to physiology to geology, revealed 1400 years ago, and read by people at that time who thought perhaps they understood it. But in reality, only through modern science can we actually have the new insights and new perspectives that allow us to perhaps understand them better than the people at the time that it was revealed to. So for example, if we take the verse that I've already looked at, now this is a slightly different translation, but hopefully it will clarify my point. We created man from an extract of clay. Then we made him as a drop in a place of settlement, firmly fixed. Then we made the drop into an alaqa, a blood clot. Then we made the alaqa into, and forgive my poor Arabic translation, into a mudgha, forgive me, sorry, I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, a chewed substance, that's how it's translated. Now, it's only through the use of microscopes and sophisticated equipment today that we can actually see that the external appearance of the embryo and its sacs during the alaqa stage is actually the appearance of a blood clot. And it's only through this technology of ultrasounds and microscopes and other equipment that we can understand that the next stage of the mudgha is actually the embryo looking like chewed gum. And it's quite remarkable if you actually look at the photos of this. Another verse to again sort of give you, emphasize this example is, have we made the earth as a bed and the mountains as pegs? Qur'an in Surah 78, verse 6 to 7. Again, and I only came, my friend was actually telling me how science has actually looked in depth at this. And what they found is that if you look at the mountain, geologists have actually dug underground to look at mountains, and what they found is that the mountain almost has a root that is bigger than the mountain itself. So just as the Qur'an describes, and I believe geologists actually describe it in a similar way, that the mountains have pegs, is the reality of what we have in existence today, that these mountains have actually put in their place and implanted deep into the ground with pegs that stabilize them. But what it says to me is that actually people today, just like the Prophet, peace be upon him, once said would happen, people today can understand this message better, perhaps, than people at the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, to which it was initially revealed. A second parameter I think that we need to take into account is how our current social context can actually affect our understanding and information that we derive from reading the Qur'an. To give you a very small example of this, and I'm sure there's many more, but I know that I'm really pushed for time. But there's a verse in the Qur'an which talks about when you need to prepare for battle. And of course, there's no condoning of battle, preparing for war and what have you, that Islam legitimizes in any unfair way. But if it's for the protection of oneself, if it's for the defense of oneself, the Qur'an is saying that in that sort of circumstance, prepare yourself for battle. And it says, use steeds of war. Steeds of war referring, obviously, at that time to preparing your horses. Prepare your horses for battle. But no one in their right mind today would say that actually if we were in that position, we would use horses. We would use technology, perhaps, of that time to be able to fight and defend ourselves in current circumstances. We would use the technology of the day. So what does this tell us? That words in the Qur'an cannot always be taken literally. They need to be caveated and understood through the essence and the spirit with which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has presented them to us. And thirdly, there's an overarching principle of social justice and humanity in Islam that the Qur'an gives to us. And there's various verses, and I should have brought some more examples, but I haven't done, I'm afraid, today. But various verses would look at this and break this down and say, this is what Islam is really all about. Now, if we look at, say, something like the concept of slavery, I don't think anyone in their right mind today would say that Islam condones slavery, that it accepts slavery, that it would, allow slavery to exist today. And yet, when we look at the Qur'an itself, when we study the verses of the Qur'an, there is nowhere that clearly states that it has been abolished. There is nowhere that completely negates the likelihood that it could happen again. And yet scholars have looked at this and analyzed this and understood, actually, through the example of the Prophet, peace be upon him, the living, walking Qur'an, through the various verses of the Qur'an, we can understand that actually slavery has no place. Slavery has no part. And we're given examples of when how the Prophet, peace be upon him, encouraged companions to free slaves. We're given examples of how companions themselves look down upon that. I think there's an incident when Umar radiallahu anhu actually rebukes people, saying to them, how did you enslave people when they were born free? So this whole idea of the Qur'an moving in a direction to eliminate social injustice, to look at human rights, is an evolving one. The Qur'an came and it sets the direction. But with each generation, we need to understand that better and apply it better in the social circumstances that we're in the context that we're in, to make the lives of people, not just Muslims, but humanity, better for the world. Looking at wider teachings of the Qur'an and linking it back into this divine purpose is extremely important. And what that creates for us today is a framework of how we look at the Qur'an and how we make sure it remains relevant to us. We need to open this up more and recognize that our understanding of these issues has to be constantly evolving to be relevant for our children. A permanent message must display to mankind a permanent and everlasting miracle. If we pick up the Qur'an today and we don't feel that, we don't realize that, then perhaps there's something deficient in the way that we are reading it or understanding it. The reality is, I feel, that much of our understanding of Islam is actually deeply affected by centuries of age-old interpretation of verses in the Qur'an and Hadith that weren't necessarily done in any sort of malicious way or bad intent. But those people, given their set of social circumstances, their access to knowledge, their environment, gave their best analysis of verses, gave their best analysis of what was best for humanity at that time. But I don't feel that that's necessarily been reassessed enough to take into account our current context or the complexities that today's world presents us with. Instead, we're still looking at these very old interpretations of verses, which may once have been revolutionary, but are now perhaps sometimes looked upon as backward, or at best, what everyone else is already doing. How are we visionary? How are we moving forward? How are we taking things forward? Islam, for me, came to propel the world forward towards peace, towards justice, towards goodness. The Qur'an was to be our illuminating guide for justice and righteousness. So we do ourselves a huge disservice by not re-looking at this and analyzing it, making it appropriate for our context today. And when most of us first started practicing Islam, it was with some degree of questioning cultural tradition versus true Islamic requirement. We're bringing up our children today to question, to inquire, to critique. Surely then it's going to be natural for them to ask questions that we perhaps didn't. And the Qur'an, in fact, encourages this. Verse after verse after verse, we get this idea of the Qur'an asking humanity to think and reflect, to question, to look into. Islam is strong enough to fend for itself. Islam is strong enough to have the answers if we're brave enough to probe and ask the right questions. But if we're truly sincere about feeling that this Qur'an is a miracle from God, and we're truly sincere in our understanding that we feel this message can actually change the world, we feel that it can produce the famous scholars of the past, not just in Islam, but in the sciences, in the arts, in law, in English, in all sorts of subjects, where Muslims are at the forefront of society leading the world, then we must be brave enough to admit that we need to go back to the text, we need to go back to the sources, we need to encourage our scholars to think about things, reflect things, and use things that will apply relevance to our lives today and make a real difference to the way that we choose to live our lives in Britain. Jazakallah khair.